let's get rolling. Welcome, everyone. We're going to talk about a two-part series we've got here on cottages and estate planning. I'm joined by Susanna Popovic-Montag, who is online but off screen, and Jordy is supposed to be making a cameo appearance, hopefully near the beginning of this, given my strict script that I have created for this podcast that Jordy needs to help me with at the start. But if he doesn't join us, no problem. We try to give Jordy a bit of a break from time to time, and that's fair. We're talking about an important part of estate planning, and that, of course, ties with, we are using the term cottages, but recreational property generally applies here, of course. And the estate planner itself has some specific tools that we are using to help aid in the drafting of this. And at some point, if Jordy joins the call, we'll have him do a quick demo. But we want to talk about this two-part series, a bit of the granular thinking on what estate planning options we have and how to do it, and consider some of the special options for your clients. I'm actually, full disclosure, standing outside in beautiful Bermuda, where I'm down here on work, which is not a curse, but you may hear a boat in the background because I had to come over to a spot where there's some potential noise. But anyway, all right, so let's, Michaela's going to do the slides. So if you don't mind, Michaela, could you go to the next slide? And I'll just ask Susanna just to give us some introductory comments and thoughts about recreational properties generally and the unique estate planning issues that arise.
Thanks very much, Ian, and hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here to join you in. I think recreational properties, and particularly the cottage property right now, is really, really timely as we're heading into the last few weeks of summer. And for those people who are lucky enough to have cottages, we certainly know that, the planning for their succession is something that's going to be top of the mind. And the reason for that really is because of the fact that, with the real estate market being the way it is, for the most part, the largest assets people tend to have are their homes, and they're lucky enough to have a recreational property. And with the escalation in values, of course, comes the dreaded tax liabilities, or the tax, moments in time when someone passes away, that really start to take a toll on how people are going to plan for these properties in the future.
So just in terms of our first slide, discussing with your heirs, we're big proponents of that. And perhaps the single most important discussion to have with your heirs tends to be the picking of a executor. We've talked about that in the past, but just discussing some of the options with your heirs is something that we encourage with our clients a lot. And today and tomorrow, in the next podcast, we're going to talk about some of the things to talk about. And it's not just a general suggestion and general considerations. We want to talk about some of the specifics about how to raise this issue with your clients and help them go through this issue, because typically I'm encouraging my clients to do this discussion, and I'm not there for the discussion, but I help out with some of the agenda items for them to consider. So the discussion with the heirs is paramount in that regard. Susanna, do you have anything else to add on that point before we go to our next slide?
Yeah, I think it really is, as you say, very important, because we all presume that the children may want the cottage when you pass away, and that may not actually be the case. And so we really do need to explore with our clients if there is an appetite for this, if there is the real incentive to keep the property within the family, because if it isn't, then we'd be doing all of this planning for naught, and there could be other ways by which we can plan for eventualities that otherwise may not even necessarily arise. And I think that really is the main discussion that you want to have, in terms of which will then inform, of course, how things get planned for eventually, whether the property is going to be transferred, it's going to be gifted, sold, or what have you.
So Jordy, if you're online, that's great, let us know. But if you're not, one of the things that, before we get into the granular, is always nice to look at high level. And a tool that, from a drafting standpoint, that we use and have employed an estate planner directly, is the idea of really, we call it allowing our clients to get the kids to get their sea legs. So we provide for a trust in the first 2 years after death that's funded by the estate, and that A, and then B, that we allow for the general sort of opportunity for all of the beneficiaries to purchase the property, and we create a mechanism to the purchase process. So we're going to get a little more granular on that, but let's go to the next slide, Michaela. Thanks. All right, so the capital gains taxes, of course, that's something well known to all of us, and I think this is as simply as put as it's just that the question is, do you have that 25 cents on the dollar available to pay the capital gains? Because of course that is a gigantic stumbling block in the whole transition of wealth. And if you haven't created a fund, or you haven't got life insurance, or you don't have enough in your estate, then all the planning you've done can be for naught, because the capital gains tax is due and owing within 18 months approximately of death, which is not something you can overcome easily. So I don't think we have to get too more into that, other than say that that's something that we want to look to our clients to say, are there ways to do this creatively, to fund it creatively? Maybe it's going to take borrowing, maybe it's going to take an insurance policy or something like that. But what is it we're going to do to smooth that part over? And then secondly, who's going to pay the capital? Those considerations there. Suzanne, I don't know if you have anything else to add on that, but we don't want to, we're not tax lawyers, but we just like to raise this issue with our clients.
No, I think that you've nailed it in, and we all know that the taxman is going to get their money one way or another. And when that messes with the planning that you've spent good money on or spent good time on, it's most unfortunate. So having these discussions and planning for it in advance is really the key.
Okay, the next slide. Thanks, Michaela. All right. We just mentioned again that the use of life insurance is an option, and something that's maybe many of my clients will say, well, look, I'm not insurable, or it's too late, and the price of it is not manageable. But often if you explore joint last to die policies and things like that, there is some flexibility there, and you might have an opportunity. But those are just things for your clients to consider. The next slide, please. All right, Susanna, do you have anything else to add to the transfer of the on the tax management issue before we go to our next slide?
Sorry, I'm still having some technical difficulties. So just anything to add? You were saying on the transfer during lifetime, or were you still on the insurance?
Yes, the transfer. So this is in the scenario where we got our planning is during the lifetime. We've created some sort of arrangements with our whoever is going to receive the cottage, and what are some of the high level tax considerations at that point to watch out for?
Sure. So when we're talking about different ways to transfer it during your lifetime, there's of course selling it to your children outright. You can decide to gift the property to them while you're still alive, either by making them joint owners of the property with you, or transferring the property to them outright, or even transferring to a trust with having the children as the ultimate beneficiaries of that trust. And again, all three of these options are going to trigger an immediate tax capital gain in your name, the transferor's name or the gifter's name, and then any future capital gains on the property will then accrue to the next generation, and it won't be payable while they're still alive, and as long as they continue to hold the property. But at some point, of course, that tax will crystallize.
All right, so let's go to our next slide. Thanks, Susanna. The option of gifting, of course, is another consideration to work through with your client. Obviously, it's going to trigger the capital gains, which may be not desirable, but it also gives you an opportunity to solidify and crystallize the planning, which in and of itself can be important, because leaving your kids in limbo as to which way it's going to go and how it's going to be managed may not be suitable for every client. And the idea of gifting is crucial. Properly gifted, of course, because it's real estate, is a important sort of first step in terms of its the mechanism. I don't know if you have anything else to add on gifting, Susanna.
Yeah, I think the added bonus to gifting is that the land transfer taxes don't apply to these kinds of gifts, and your estate is going to be able to ultimately avoid probate taxes as well, which is often something that people are always trying to avoid at all costs.
Absolutely. Okay, if we go to the next slide, Michaela, thanks. Sale, of course, is and this is one I think if Jordy was on the line, he would say is his most often recommended, and I respect that. It's the sale of the property is a simple and effective way of avoiding the high tension that comes out of cottages. I mean, I think in our contentious practice, Susanna, I would say that second marriages and cottages drive some of the most hotly contested litigation that we're involved with. And so if you just can't see a solution, it's not the worst thing in the world to sit down with your family and or not, but just make the hard decision and sell the property before, so that you can avoid what is potentially a highly emotional unfolding of the issues. That's just a private sort of a practice point that I like to consider with my clients. And as I say, Jordy's a big fan of this as the options as well. Susanna, do you have anything else to add on sale?
Yeah, I was going to say that if you do decide to sell the property, of course, you'll want to do it at fair market value from a tax standpoint, because otherwise you're still going to be charged the capital gains taxes on the full fair market value, even if you sell it for less, if you're selling it to children at a discounted value, for instance.
Well, that's a good point. Okay, next slide, please, Michaela. Thanks. So we talked about the planning that we often will recommend if clients want to hang on to the recreational property until they die and pass it through their will. That's setting up some sort of recreational property trust, allowing all the parties sort of a bit of time, breathing space to transfer the property. And the other option, of course, is simply just setting up a living trust, an inter vivos trust, transferring the property. There's obviously some pitfalls to that Suzanne will talk about in a moment, but this is a planning tool that I always like to at least canvas with my clients. Has to be worth it in my view. The costs of administering a trust are sometimes not worth the headache of creating the trust itself, but it's a tool that's available. And I know there's some other pitfalls, Susanna, that you were going to mention.
Yes, for sure. The transfer, of course, once you transfer it into the trust, is going to trigger an immediate capital gains tax liability. But the advantage of the trust structure is that you still can control the property even during your lifetime. And then once you pass away, of course, the control is going to pass to your children on death. And again, there's going to be no immediate liability to them in terms of probate, capital gains, or land transfer taxes. So one of the things you keep in mind when we're dealing with that, does allow you to have the control, but there is still that immediate taxable, gains moment.
Yeah, I mean, we all see planning as being an opportunity to push the tax liability out as long as you can. But sometimes, again, from a practical standpoint, it's better just to pay the tax and get on with it. But the living trust is, and inter vivos trusts bring with it a lot of hurdles as well, because what often happens I see is that people don't operate the trust in a way that it should be. So it's not properly operated during its lifetime. And so people say, oh yeah, no, I set up a cottage trust years ago, and then they never file the returns, they never deal with the administrative steps that need to be dealt with. And of course, now we've got mandatory disclosure of ownership of trust interests with CRA. So that may be adding another layer of headache that may or may not be worth it. All right, we'll go to the next slide. Thanks. Well, so transfers on death. Susanna, did you want to speak to this?
So if the tax considerations aren't something that are going to be a big concern, or you've done your advanced planning with life insurance and that, there are going to be like other ways that we can certainly deal with these the transfers. And one of the ones that I alluded to earlier was really just the option of putting the property into joint names with your heirs or whoever it is you intend to ultimately inherit the property. And so you would be adding them during your lifetime, and upon your death, there would be the right of survivorship to those individuals. And, you've given up, unfortunately, the control during your lifetime, and there are going to be, again, taxable moments in time. But it is one of the ways that we see many clients planning for the ultimate succession of the recreational properties.
Sorry, Suzanne. Okay, so we go to the next slide. Thanks. Joint tenancy, the most famous estate planning element we all see day in and day out in all sorts of practice, happening more and more with cottages and recreational properties. The tool itself is obvious. We all know it well, but it needs a special, unique circumstances, it seems to me, to apply to a cottage situation. There are benefits that we all know of, but one of the hurdles, of course, is some of the risks, of course, is your loss of control over the asset. And it's a risk that I find too often people don't spend enough time with their clients talking through the concept that no matter what benefits you see on the face of the transfer into a joint tenancy, how are you ready for the loss of control? Are you ready for the loss of ownership in that sense? You can easily have that joint tenancy severed by a child who's grumpy with you, or all of a sudden feels that they need to treat the asset differently and that kind of thing. So Susanna, what are your thoughts on the joint tenancy of the cottage in particular?
I think another downside of a joint tenancy arrangement is that, you know, we have this presumption of the natural order of things. And if it turns out that one of the joint tenants actually predeceases you, then their interest is automatically going to pass to the other joint tenants, which means that, you know, their children or the other beneficiaries won't necessarily receive any interest in the vacation property. And that may not have been what you would have intended had you sort of thought it through to that next level.
Absolutely an important distinguishing point. Okay, so again, at this point with the time, we've had a chance to talk through with our clients with some of the planning options that are available, all of which I know everyone on this call is familiar with the general concepts, but the pitfalls of them, I think, are the things that I like to make sure that I've at least highlighted with the clients. So rose-colored glasses, they go into the deal, they think everything's going to work great with passing on this important emotional asset, but they haven't walked through all of the pitfalls. We'll just go to the next slide if we could. All right, Susanna, gifts by will, which we've talked about generally. I don't know if you have anything to add on that at this point.
I think I would just simply say that, you know, in these kinds of cases, you're either going to give it to the individuals outright or you're going to set up a trust. And in most cases, of course, the beneficiary of the property is going to have to wait until the will is actually probated and probate tax has been paid and any capital gains tax has been addressed. And so even though your heirs will likely not have to pay the land transfer taxes, there are going to be some exceptions on taxes that, you know, we want to make sure that we're exploring with our clients and giving them a heads up on in terms of what may ultimately unfold.
Yeah, the two big surprises with this I always find are who's going to pay for the ongoing costs of maintenance, and then the secondly is taxes and the tax surprises that that people get hit with, whatever planning tool they choose. So important to consider both who's going to fund this on a go-forward basis and who's going to fund the immediate tax exposures that are going to get created. Even as granular as, you know, who's paying the tax on the property, the property tax on the cottage. You know, up in Muskoka with the prices that went so nuts, a lot of families that held cottages for a long time, and they found their property taxes went up tenfold in some cases, and so the funding of that alone became a pressure point. So it's just something I always like to walk through the client, make sure they've covered their basis on that front. We'll just go to the next slide. Susanna, outright gifts. So that, of course, can create its own tension, but can, as we've already talked about, can be a solution in some respects. Do you have anything to add on the outright?
Yeah, I think you alluded to it just recently, and when you said, you know, the costs of maintaining a cottage property. So if you leave it to all your children, for instance, and perhaps one or more of them uses it more than the rest of them, and then it comes down to how do we allocate, you know, first the usage, but secondly, the costs that come from having to maintain the property and what is equitable and what is fair. And although we can't plan for every single eventuality, we do want to give some thought to that because, you know, otherwise we're just going to be setting up an arrangement that's going to cause strife on the family, and that's certainly not what was intended when, you know, you decide to pass on your recreational property to your children or your whomever you intended to go to.
You know, it's so true, right? Like avoid tension and make it simple. that's always been my motto with estate planning. So watching for the pitfalls that create tension or that make it complicated, something that I always make sure I've explored with my clients. Michaela, we'll just go to our next slide. Thanks. All right, we talked about the testamentary trust and the opportunity to create a breathing space, and or you can expand it. Of course, you could put the cottage into a testamentary trust outright as well. These are just more obvious planning options that are available to us. Susanna, do you have anything to add on that?
I think when we're setting up a testamentary trust where the trust is going to carry on in some period of time, it really becomes necessary to turn our minds to some kind of a maintenance fund for the property, because otherwise, it could be that there's the expectations about how these things are going to be paid and how they're going to be allocated may not necessarily be met. So I know I expect you'll be alluding to it a little bit later, but certainly having some kind of an agreement even amongst the beneficiaries in terms of how the property is going to be maintained, or like a wish list in terms of how you wish the children to conduct themselves in the future might be something that you may want to give some thought to.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to go through carefully in the second half of this podcast an cottage agreement and some of the considerations to include in that agreement, what those agreements look like, how to create it, have the discussions with your clients, and then them having the discussions with their family. So the cottage agreement is part two, and then is fundamental to any of our estate planning that we work with our clients on. Michaela, can we just go to the next slide, thanks? All right, so at this point, we're going to actually pause and move through this topic in more detail at the next podcast. I will just double check if Jordy is online or not. He may not be. And
I'm here.
Awesome. Jordy, do you mind spending a couple of minutes now just showing us a little bit about what the estate planner does to assist us in really carrying through these concepts? I mean, it's all about making this stuff tangible and in the drafting side. So do you mind taking a few minutes on that before we close?
Absolutely. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Susanna. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I just, there's so many issues that Ian and Susanna have raised where we can fall down on cottage planning, and here's where software can help a bit. And I'm just going to share my screen. But you've talked about, and we're talking right now about all the testamentary planning for cottages, for example. And if you know estate, it's an initial gift when you're dealing with a specific asset, right? It would be a bequest or a trust for the cottage, etc. But let's just take the simple one where it's an absolute gift of the cottage. So, you might want to always think about whether if that cottage is not around, but there's a substitute property there, do you want that to go as well to that beneficiary? Do you want them to assume the mortgage or not? And lastly, often with cottages, what people want to do is they want one of the kids to be able to get that cottage as part of their share. Right. In other words, yes, I want you to get the right to have that cottage, but not on top of and not in priority to the rest of the residue. So that function is dealt with by deducting it from the beneficiary share by way of basically like a hodgepodge clause. And you still have the same issues that you have whenever you have an option to purchase, for example. You need to think about, okay, how is the price going to be set? Are we going to fix it now, or are we going to base it on the fair market value at that time? Is it going to be done by appraisals, and how many appraisals, and what happens if you have more than one, and who's going to pay for the appraisals, and what about discounts for notional commission? And if one of the beneficiaries, the residuary beneficiaries, doesn't agree, or even the person who has the right to take the cottage doesn't agree with the valuation, do they have the right to get their own? And if so, how quickly, and who pays, and how quickly do we close? All of those are things that if you don't use software, you got to remember and cover off with your client. And that's one of the great benefits of that. Not to mention that, of course, when you click the button, it generates the will with all of those provisions. And what we typically do is have a provision that says, look, if my kids can agree, this is my intention, that one of my kids gets the cottage as part of their share, for example. and and they get it as part of their share, et cetera. And if they can't agree, then there's an option to purchase, right? That kind of language. And then so that's how you can do an absolute gift. The other one, and this is often what the solution is, that parents say, look, I want to give my kids a certain amount of time to work this out. Let's hold the cottage at the expense of the estate for a period of time, a couple of years, a year, 5 years, whatever it is. We'll pay we being the estate, the deceased parents will pay the expenses until the kids can figure it out. And then, then it gets terminated. And so the trust gets terminated. And then basically maybe there's an option to purchase by one of the beneficiaries. If one of them wants to buy it, or if there's more than one, do we do it in random order? All those kinds of things that you can set up and build in. And that's, again, one of the great features of software. You can talk about who's going to pay the expenses and, what happens at the end of the trust. Is there an option to purchase? And if more than one wants to buy it, is there an order of priority? You buy it, you get the first option, then you get the next option, then et cetera. Or is there a random selection? Because co-owning the cottage, those try to get around the idea that, oh yeah, if 2 out of 3 want to buy it, I don't want them as, they may not, that may just lead to further problems. So I'm going to build in some mechanism for making sure that I only end up with one owner. So these are all things that, when you get down into the nitty gritty, you've got to, keep on your checklist and make sure that you draft it accordingly, because it's crucial that's done, and that you sort of think through those issues. So I've just got to actually jump off. So, maybe let me just stop sharing and turn it back over to you, Ian.
Well, thank you so much, Jordy. We really appreciate you stepping in and sharing that little bit. It's definitely, you see how many potential pitfalls there are if we haven't turned our mind to specifically all of these individual things. And so it's wonderful to be able to have the benefit of technology to help us guide through that. So I'm just looking at our time here, and I think we're going to wrap up this podcast discussion, and we look forward to our next one, where we'll continue with part 2 and the estate planning considerations when dealing with recreational properties. A very special thank you to Ian for having hosted this, and Jordy for joining us, and all of you for being here with us today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll look forward to speaking with you again.